So essentially our very first commercial project, we really didn't have like any product when we were starting out. 3 people, project took literally 9 months that should have taken,
Yeah.
1 month.
All right. Well, welcome to the podcast, Andy.
Thanks for having me.
I thought we could jump right in. Maybe we could start with, your background. What is Path AI's mission? And then what was the founding journey?
Sure. So my background is I trained first as a pathologist. So I went to medical school and did pathology, which is the specialty within medicine that's based in the laboratory and is responsible for diagnosing diseases based on tissue samples. So things like biopsies or blood samples go into pathology and they have to make a diagnosis. But I also did a PhD in machine learning at a similar time, kind of very early in my career. And I've always been interested in sort of bringing those two things together. How do we use machine learning to better make diagnoses that are more accurate, more reproducible, that could provide new insights into what's causing disease, leading to better therapies. And then I was in research for about 5 years and started Path AI in 2016 with the mission of improving patient outcomes with AI-powered pathology. And I've been doing this ever since for about the last 7 years.
Wow. Amazing. And what types of obstacles did you face in the way or along the way? And how did you overcome some of them?
Yeah, so when we started the company, there's a number of different obstacles, I would say, with any company. So one is getting the technology, to work and to be significantly better than what's out there to begin with, which is obviously hard when you're starting from scratch with essentially zero resources, very, very few people. So I would say the biggest first challenge was definitely technology and getting something that that was better than the status quo or better than what's already there with far fewer resources. We were, I'd say, incredibly fortunate to be sort of very much starting the company right after deep learning came out as a really new technology that was orders of magnitude better than what came before. And there really wasn't a lot yet that was sort of commercial on the market that users could access with deep learning. So we had that ability to kind of start with that very focused technology in mind, and then it was really, in a very resource constrained way. How do we then, focus that technology on areas that could be of immediate value to partners that we want to work with? That was kind of the second big challenge, figuring out, how can we sort of begin to productize or at least have technology-enabled service, leveraging this technology that would be useful. And then a lot of it is, how do you actually go and sell it? How do you sell this to different customers? How do you provide the best service, the best responsiveness to their needs? And then really try to do that in a scalable way over time. So those are a bunch of challenges. Each one, we certainly had to learn a ton along the way and learn from all of our mistakes to try to improve in each of those different areas.
Makes sense. And since you are an AI company and you're focused on really, getting a flywheel and, improving your models over time, I'm curious, how did you get past that first hurdle of getting some initial data and building a model that works? Even if you have, all of these great, of course, ImageNet and other things, are more on versus very specific gigapixel size whole slide images can look very different and are much less, let's say, prevalent, or at least easy to get access to. So I'm curious, how did you think about that?
Yeah, I think every company is different. I can tell you the way Path AI started was we did know what we wanted it to deliver, which is important. Like we knew what good might look like if the system worked, but we absolutely did not have the data. To your point, pathology data is unique because it's very private in the sense you can't just really find significant amounts of it on the internet. Even if you can, often it's very specialized within pathology, but you want to train on like a particular stain. So we had an initial partner who luckily was extremely patient because we basically went in like undercut who they were going to currently be paying by a lot, like five
Uh-huh.
times cheaper, which of course was in retrospect not scalable
Totally.
or
Yeah.
anything. But so we came in very cheap, and then I'm sure we super overpromised on how quickly we could deliver. And it was like crazy the scale of the project. It was something like 20 different markers across across hundreds of different slides. So it was like a
Mhm.
massive project, and we had like three people, no
Mhm.
resources. So we actually had an okay data set of slides to start with because we were sort of doing both development
Mhm.
and training and delivery all
Mhm.
in one. But we had over time we've built a large network of annotators to help rapidly generate
Mhm.
annotations. But literally at the beginning, I was doing
Mhm.
annotations, and I don't really have the patience for it, and they were not very good. And then we have to learn that okay, we need to get other labelers, and it was very much three people. Project took literally 9 months that should have taken
Yeah.
1 month. But we were working on it full time and learning by like doing every component with just two or
Yep.
three people. And there we really again learned from our failures along the way, but we at least knew what we had to do. And luckily, we did have a very patient partner for this very
Mhm.
first project who was kind of willing to work with us as we iteratively got it better. So that's kind of how we did it. So I'd say data is one part of it, but you mentioned how humongous these pathology
Mhm.
images are. So really the scarce resource sometimes is less the number of
Mhm.
slides. It is more getting these expert
Mhm.
annotations. We realized that in our very first project, what a big deal that is, and how in order to scale as a business, we'd have to really solve that problem. And that really got us focused on something we've built that I think is the leading one in the industry, which is a whole network of expert labelers in pathology who have a whole platform to serve. And now we can get thousands of annotations in hours that would have taken us, potentially months for that first project. So it was definitely, we were lucky to have a very patient partner who, I'm sure we lost a significant amount of money on this project, but it gave sort of the invaluable training to learn what we have to do to be a uh, much better delivering that sort of set of results in the future.
Got it. Yeah, makes sense. So then, yeah, you really went above and beyond in that first project, learn everything, go, take your time, and then over time, that those learnings were useful in future engagements.
Yeah, and I would say this would be like I think a pretty extreme example of like the lean startup
Hmm.
type idea. Basically, just like go to a customer with almost nothing, and kind of they tell you what they
Yeah.
want, and then really building it along the way. So essentially, our very first commercial project, we really didn't have like any product when we were starting out. We just had ideas and a few smart
Mhm.
people, I guess, to
Yeah.
help do it. But then it was all just building it on the fly. And then by the end of it, we're like, okay, this is what a product could look like. Versus, a 2 year development
Yeah.
cycle, and then like a launch, and you hit the market, and you don't know what's going to happen. We very much did it super iteratively there in the
Yeah.
beginning.
No, that's super cool. Yeah, it's like building the plane as you're flying it, and then
Sure.
doing that before it crashes. So yeah, that's very cool. I thought we could maybe talk about doing well. So, we talked a little bit about the journey. Um, what makes Path AI's business sustainable in the short term and long term? Uh, and how do you make money?
Sure. So I think in terms of this doing well, I mean, one is focusing on the end product or service you're providing, or service your product's providing, being something that really does create value and is
Hmm.
valuable and is to some degree a scarce resource. So for us, that would be really accurate and reproducible interpretation of these images, both for driving advances in
Hmm.
research as well as driving clinical decisions, so clinical care. So we really focused our sort of machine learning attention on something that's extremely important for both and will create value because it's a scarce resource that people really value. It can be critical for whether a drug makes it through
Hmm.
clinical development. It certainly can be critical for whether patients in the real world um, get the right diagnosis, which will then lead to the right therapy. So clearly, just focusing on an important problem. And then in terms of how is this sustainable, one where it really technology can provide improvements in efficiency, and you can have really strong unit economics where although you might invest a huge amount of money upfront to building these models, once they're built, the marginal cost of deploying on a new slide is relatively low, and the value created should actually increase over time as you continue to add more samples, say, to the training
Hmm.
data set. So that really strong unit economics is super important. That you're doing something that's essentially essential and not a
Hmm.
nice to have for a certain market. In our case, both research as well as clinical
Hmm.
practice. That's kind of what's
Hmm.
sustainable, and and I think the same sort of principle would hold to this. Like how do you do do good at the same time? Is that like we have very strong alignment between the accuracy, reproducibility, and predictive power of our models
Hmm.
and the financial success
Hmm.
of the business. And I think both of those, as long as they're super well aligned, enables us to do both if we're doing our
Hmm.
job well.
And on the point of doing well, and you mentioned that there's unit economics with models. Let's say that, so obviously research and clinical, they're going to have different regulatory oversight and different ways of kind of assessing how good these models are. But do you see that there are some common elements between those two types of final products? And do you feel like, because there are, obviously with ChatGPT and a lot of foundational models people are talking about these days, people are asking the question, are there unit economics in building larger models that can grow over time, become more, do more tasks effectively, and then ensure that, of course, you have different regulatory and different evaluation metrics for research versus your clinical outcome. So curious how you think about that.
Yeah, so I think it's important to focus your attention on a problem that if you solve it, the core elements of it really are stable across
Mm-hmm.
both. So for example, the slide itself looks absolutely identical, whether it happens to be from a patient in a clinical trial
Mm-hmm.
for research or whether it happens to be from a patient who's not in a clinical trial but is just being treated in the
Mm-hmm.
clinic. So the sort of technical task, the core of it is the same. A lot of the minimum data required for each slide is exactly the same. For example, you may need to know what's the diagnosis, what's the
Mm-hmm.
grade, how big is the invasive tumor, for example. That's the kind of the minimum data you need in research, but that's also the data that's important in
Right.
clinical. And then in research, you typically can also measure a large set of exploratory features that are just totally irrelevant on the clinical side and that aren't going to be used to inform any decision or there's not any
Mm-hmm.
evidence for it. And I think having one component that's identical between the two or very
Mm-hmm.
similar in terms of what is the input and what is the output, and then research you often have additional elements enables one to very efficiently serve the needs of these two different markets. And as you mentioned, they certainly do have different regulatory considerations, not even just across research and clinical, but
Mm-hmm.
within clinical and within research, depending on the kind of risk benefit potential trade-offs or efficacy safety
Mm-hmm.
trade-offs um, in different contexts of use in the research side or in the
Mm-hmm.
clinical side. So we really very much have to think about that similarly for whether it happens to be in a clinical trial or in clinical
Mm-hmm.
practice.
And one other question on this. So when you're thinking about making money, in this case, I believe you sell to biopharma companies, and so how do you ever see a scenario? I guess maybe two questions. Have you seen this in the past, and or do you expect that this might happen in the future? But do you see a scenario where balancing shareholder value could be in conflict with the mission or culture of the business, or do you feel like they're fairly well aligned?
I think we've set up the company in such a way and what our technology does that they really are well aligned. I mean, we very much have built it so that the goal is more accuracy, more reproducibility, more predictiveness, generating more accurate quantitative data from
Hmm.
tissue samples. And I think because that's really how we framed the problems we're solving that would then lead to AI powered
Hmm.
pathology. Improving patient outcomes. I don't have any obvious examples for them being misaligned, although it is always really important to think, to have a very clear story of how the work we're doing is improving patient outcomes and not doing the reverse. So I do think because of the way we've structured our company, and we really don't have. Typically, we really just want to get the most accurate readouts from tissue samples. It's kind of hard to picture how that could be misaligned with improving patient
Mhm.
outcomes. I mean, you could picture things like that we're not doing and we're not
Yeah.
really set up to do, like intentionally giving false results, which will make a trial look successful for a drug that isn't
Right.
actually successful. I'm just saying, but like we're
Yeah.
nowhere near that kind of
Totally.
thing or have the ability to do any of that. So it's actually hard for me to picture. I think in general, if you're just doing like straight ahead
Hmm.
diagnostics, which
Hmm.
we're doing, or straight ahead
Hmm.
therapeutics for serious unmet
Hmm.
medical needs, I think generally they're going to be pretty well aligned. I think there's other things that say if it's purely around billing
Yeah. Yeah.
efficiency or purely around how to get reimbursed from
Hmm.
payers and to increase the rate at which you're going to get paid from payers, there are different areas of administrative tasks within drug development
Hmm.
or clinical care where I think it would be less obvious and there might be more areas where it's a little less clear, or if it's just about more effective targeted
Right.
advertising. There are all these different areas where I think there could be more ambiguity, but I think if you're kind of on pure diagnostics or pure
Yeah.
therapeutics, um, it's at least a little more difficult to think how the
Hmm.
company could have misaligned incentives. Although I'm sure there could
Yeah.
be examples, and we do have to be vigilant to keep in mind, the patient's really at the center of
Totally.
everything.
And I guess, yeah, just going back to your point, it also feels that, the biopharma companies, at least the teams that Pathology is working with around the research and around, clinical development, they're more focused on getting good patient outcomes. And so, for them, it's also not valuable necessarily to quote unquote fake data in any way, because that wouldn't be
Of
useful
course
for
not.
them
Yeah.
either, because at some point that might be revealed and then, the trial will be unsuccessful anyways. So it's not
Yeah,
valuable.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, having been in academia and in
Hmm.
pharma, I think this is one thing. I actually think the risks, and I'm not the
Yeah.
first to say this, the risks are far higher in
Yeah.
pharma.
Yeah.
Like the stakes are
Hmm.
far higher. Like the level of rigor
Hmm.
required is
Yeah.
far higher than if you're just running your own little lab where your goal is just to get a paper in
Hmm.
Nature, and it actually doesn't matter for you personally or for patients
Yeah.
as much versus running this being the key decision point for whether I kick off a 1,500 patient trial.
Yeah.
Like you really want to make sure you're basing that kind
Millions
of
of dollars,
decision
right?
on very
Yeah.
strong data.
Yeah.
Hundreds of millions, yeah,
Yeah.
tons of, yeah, so absolutely.
Yeah, no, totally makes sense. Okay, yeah, so that's a very logical, and I will get into some of these questions of, in the general healthcare and biotech space, where could things potentially get misaligned? But it sounds like because of the way and because of who you work with and your goal at Path AI, haven't seen that. Hopefully, never have to deal with that, but makes sense. Um, Thought we could go into some of the doing good parts. So, doing good, what do we mean? Really, it's making a positive impact on the world, helping patients. So, the question we usually ask is, what global challenge do you think that Path AI is solving? And how do you feel like that would, what is success in that after, let's say, 10 years or 15
Mm-hmm.
years or 20 years?
Yeah, so I'd say, I mean, the biggest global problem is the scarcity of expert diagnosticians
Mm,
around the world. So to some degree, this is a problem, say in the U.S., where is our primary focus today, but it's a far greater problem in developing countries around the world, where as there's overall improvements, the need for overall improvements in general quality of life and in infrastructure, there's going to be an increasing need for access to expert diagnoses as things like chronic diseases become more and more common and become the largest cause of morbidity and
mhm,
mortality. So this is a great problem that can be potentially addressed with technology like what we're building, which is really all about democratizing and making more ubiquitous around the world access um, to diagnostic expertise that performs at the level of an expert so that you can
mhm,
really scale expertise around the world and then place this kind of diagnostic technology within an infrastructure of support to make the
mhm.
biopsy, to get the expert interpretation, and then to follow up with treatment. So we think we can really help fill a real gap, which is expert access to diagnostic expertise, and then one that will continue to improve over time once that infrastructure
Mhm.
is available.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because, uh, in the machine learning side of things, you think that in some cases you can even do better than consensus. And many people, even in the, and you mentioned the developing world, but even in the developed world, many people in the US don't have access to multiple second opinions. So it's not
Yep.
possible to necessarily get that consensus versus maybe more AI driven with human in the loop. Of course, you can provide a more holistic diagnosis or a more holistic understanding of whether this is truly what we think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can imagine a pre-screen of every sample being essentially like the state of the art in
Mhm.
machine learning. And then when the pathologist really goes down to make the diagnosis, they're already being augmented by a really strong system. And then it should make them truly more efficient, more accurate, more
Mhm.
reproducible. And if that works in the setting in the US, the same system should work, in settings around the world and should really help to standardize the quality of diagnosis.
Totally. What, and this is, we kind of, you talked about your journey at Path AI, how you started. At any point, did you ever think, why does this need to be a for profit business versus a nonprofit? And if not,
Mhm.
why not?
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely, I mean, I came from essentially the non for
Hmm.
profit world, having done academic research at Harvard Medical
Hmm.
School and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center for 5 years or so
Hmm.
before. Um, and yeah, so making it for profit, at least in our experience, dramatically increased the ability to one, raise significant funds for the effort very, very
Hmm.
quickly. So I mean, academia may not always be the best example, but like the grant writing and review and feedback process takes an incredibly long
Yeah.
time. Whereas if you have a good idea, and you put together a good plan, at least for the
Hmm.
next couple of years, what you're going to do with that, one can raise capital from venture capitalists or other investors,
Hmm.
very quickly because they really do have skin in the game and they're getting
Hmm.
something from it. And it's a system that I think allows one to raise capital quickly and then to use that capital to build, a really, really strong team
Hmm.
quickly. So I think in terms of just the first reason to go for profit or for profit can
Hmm.
work very well is the ability to have access to resources from investors who are used to investing in private companies and then to use that to attract talent and then to potentially have a truly self-sustaining
Hmm.
enterprise that if you have a business model that makes sense can continue to essentially fund itself over time through having a path to profitability and to using those profits to go back
Hmm.
to the company. Not to say a nonprofit couldn't do that as
Totally.
well. I mean, I think OpenAI started out as a
Yeah.
nonprofit, right? And then they at some point
Yep.
kind of switched. So they did all of those things as a nonprofit. So I think one should really consider
Well,
either one. I mean, they got more resources than
yeah.
anyone and more great people
Yeah.
than anyone, and they did it as a nonprofit. So
Although that
I
might
think
be an
the
outlier.
tried and
That
true.
might be an outlier.
Yeah,
$1 billion
don't say it's
as
not.
a
Not.
starting point for
Yeah,
a nonprofit is definitely not the norm.
I think we're way less of an outlier. So yeah, I think there's way more of a tried and true path for for-profit
Yeah.
companies, and that's why we did it. I mean, because we had seen, we were very motivated by what how like all the top five, most of the biggest companies were relatively
Mhm.
recent startups, including, Apple,
Totally.
Microsoft, Google, Amazon. Like they all started out as for-profit startups, and that was just kind of the
Hmm.
model.
Yeah, that makes sense. And on this podcast, we've explored this question with everyone we talk to, because the question is, what is the alternative? And it's funny that you brought up academia. Academia is certainly probably the most difficult nonprofit because the grant writing process is so rigorous, and
Yeah.
definitely, and like it'll be super rigorous for not as much money necessarily, versus most nonprofits all have grant writing processes in some way. Either they request for grants, or they rely on wealthy donors to share or to
Yep.
contribute money, only when they have the money to do it, right? And maybe it's sort of a luxury thing. So again, when the markets sort of hit, if there's more of a recession, or maybe it's sort of just like a luxury thing that the grant writers are providing. And that's not so true in academia, because probably a lot of these grants are coming from NIH or from a lot of government entities that are more robust to that. But for other nonprofits, that may not be the case, right? You might have very much not recession proof funding versus VC, where it goes up and down with the market for sure, as we've seen in the last couple of years. But at the same time, uh, there's always willingness to put money into companies that can make a big profit, and that's just the investment mindset. And so it's an interesting balance of nonprofit versus for profit.
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, and the real vision of then becoming self-sustaining, I think is exciting on the. I mean, I guess you could do that
Yeah.
either way, but certainly the for-profit one of just be truly becoming profitable and then being able to reinvest, and to not rely on fundraising as
Mhm.
the path to
Yeah,
sustainability.
and there's two parts, right? There's sustainability, and then there's growth. And I think both of those, at least from a data perspective, if you just look at the distribution of companies that have been out there, we've seen that the vast majority of ones that have been either have lasted for many, many years, and or have also grown very fast in a short number of years, have typically been for profits. And so I think the data also supports that conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, cool. Well, I thought that since you have such a deep background in healthcare and biotech, I thought we could touch a little bit upon how do you see the healthcare and biotech market? And so the first question I had on this was, do all mission-driven startups in the healthcare and biotech space really do well by doing good? What characteristics are common amongst those that do, and how do you think about it when you think about it at Path AI?
Yeah, so I think I'm sure not all of them do for sure, and there's many examples of ones who
Mm-hmm.
haven't. And I think it's often less the mission
Mm-hmm.
itself, because I was mentioning that. I think that is very important. Like the mission of,
Mm-hmm.
making improved diagnostics is very well aligned with improvements for patients, or the mission, if we were a therapeutics company, of of curing a serious disease. It's kind of hard to imagine a world where you cure that disease and that's
Mm-hmm.
not good for patients. So I think like that actually helps to set the default behavior, that these two things are well aligned, and that certainly makes it easier to keep
Mm-hmm.
them aligned. And I mentioned this before, but I think maybe if you're fully focused on something that's less obviously value creating in
Yeah.
itself, like if it were purely an administrative task to assist
Mm-hmm.
in billing or to target ads, or that could also do well by doing good, but there could be ways of gaming it where it's literally just moving
Mm-hmm.
money around and not really helping
Yeah.
people and just increasing cost to the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
system. Um, then I think a lot of it, beyond that, comes down to sort of integrity of the people and the
Mm-hmm.
culture. And we all know companies where the mission was good, what they're trying to do was good, but they were involved in
Right.
fraud and they were doing what they thought was short
Mm-hmm.
term benefit, but really showing lack of
Mm-hmm.
integrity. And anyone in any kind of social endeavor, but business endeavor, yeah, that's a risk that one needs to lead by example, and have zero tolerance essentially for. And I think that's the big risk that anyone in any company faces, whether in healthcare or not. But I think the consequences of it could be even worse in healthcare because we really have so much responsibility for
Mm-hmm.
helping patients that some of the consequences could be the worst in that
Yeah.
area.
Yeah, those are really good points. And specifically in the healthcare and biotech space, you mentioned patient outcomes and patient impact as one of those key imperatives. What do you feel like there are other aspects? You mentioned there could be some where it could be a little bit unclear. For example, if it was an administrative task, or it was just about billing, and
Yep.
for whatever reason, maybe you decide to just increase cost to the system as opposed to bring it down.
Sure.
Uh, but do you feel like patient impact and patient outcomes are the only way to achieve that positive impact, or do you feel there are other things in between? Just curious, just because you have a deep background in this space, I feel maybe you've seen some
Yeah.
of those other ones as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's in
Hmm.
between because often it's indirectly impacting patients, but still having an important effect on the system, which ultimately will help patients. So yeah, I absolutely think there are many um, important indirect advances that aren't directly impacting patients, but are impacting the overall efficiency of the
Hmm.
system, which ultimately should, for example, drug development lead to getting more effective therapies
Hmm.
approved more quickly. So absolutely, I think there are many important things there. And anyone in terms of this, the one other example I mentioned, lack of integrity
Yeah.
or fraud, there's things on the borderline, and I think they can get companies into trouble, which is obviously, I didn't mention this, but focusing
Yeah.
on short-term growth. And there can be trade-offs between growth and
Hmm.
patient impact. An obvious example would be, if you're ordering unnecessary
Hmm.
testing or
Yeah.
running something multiple times when running it once is just as good for the patient. That certainly companies have run into trouble with is putting growth ahead of what's truly in the benefit of the mission of the company. I mean,
Hmm.
that's just another example, which maybe is a special case of lack of
Hmm.
integrity. But those are the sorts of trade-offs that startups are particularly
Yeah.
vulnerable to, where growth is so
And
important.
I'm glad you brought up that last example because my next question was going to be around people talk about healthcare costs in the United States. It is very expensive. It is one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive place in the world to get treatments, many different treatments. That said, there's obviously a trade-off, right? Especially with biopharma, a lot of them say that, hey, we couldn't do the research that we do unless it costs this much. How do you think about the balance between the cost of healthcare and the benefit, the patient benefit that could come from, let's say, things like drug discovery, better drug discovery, that really could save many people's lives.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think first the advances in drug development and drug discovery, let's say in the past decade, are so major for serious diseases like
Hmm.
cancer, obesity, cardiovascular disease, potentially
Hmm.
Alzheimer's. Where we just had our first
Yeah.
approvals. I think it's never been a more exciting time in terms of therapeutic development for legitimately serious diseases that used to be almost guaranteed fatal within
Hmm.
5 years, and now patients are really managing those diseases longer with new therapies like immuno-oncology therapies in the setting of advanced
Hmm.
cancer. So I think that to me that's a huge good place to be investing money and a huge driver, an obvious driver of improved
Hmm.
outcomes. I think there are certain areas where they're just not incentivized nearly enough. A lot of non-pharmacologic interventions, like better
Hmm.
exercise, other than GLP-1s, are there other ways for people to modify their eating in ways that could improve their overall long-term outcomes? I mean, a good one that actually has been not driven by pharma, but is leading to outcomes is smoking
Yeah.
cessation. So I think one, there's a lot of dollars that could be spent to somehow incentivize behaviors that we know are incredibly
Yeah.
important, particularly things like exercise, getting in
Hmm.
shape, eating less, that's not necessarily needing to be driven by pharmacologic
Hmm.
interventions. So we do have a system that very much favors the development of drugs at the expense of other types of coaching therapy, other types of interventions that may be at the same level of efficacy with even fewer side effects and fewer costs
Hmm.
for patients. So that's a problem that's a
Yeah.
difficult one to solve. I mean, I think if you just look at where the dollars go, a huge part of the increase in spending has been in
Hmm.
administration on the clinical
Yeah.
side in particular. So there's this massive ballooning of
Hmm.
administrative costs, which I don't think anyone could really argue has led to significant improvements in outcomes. So while it's easy to say improvements in cancer care, cancer drugs, and
Hmm.
cardiovascular drugs have led to outcomes, I think it's harder to say that the ballooning of administrative spend has led to that. So that's where I would be focusing my attention.
Hmm.
And the other thing is, it's not the drug companies who decide how much they get paid. I mean, it is the payers and the
Yeah.
regulators who have a huge amount of control for what gets approved and then how much that gets
Totally.
paid for. So I also just think, not to say the obvious, but often this conversation is focused extremely at the drug
Totally.
companies, but they're only one player in a sort of complex ecosystem that's leading to this significantly increase spending
Yeah.
over time.
And yeah, I'm glad you brought up the other interventions. We just talked to Nushin from January AI, and that was one thing she
Mm.
mentioned. They focus mainly on continuous glucose monitoring and providing an AI app that helps with managing your eating and your diet and your sugar levels. And
Yep.
that's definitely a big part of that. And of course, there's also, they also provide a supplement, because in the end, there is value in helping on like a pharmacologic level, right? Whether it's a drug that goes through deep regulatory approval, or whether it's a supplement that hopefully helps with some of your biological processes. But yeah, I think the example there is a good one, that there's kind of two sides of it. And then the second point you brought up around the cost, it is a good point that the payers are the ones that ultimately, work with the pharma companies and the hospital systems to negotiate these rates. I, what's interesting is that it's an interesting state that we're in, because if you tell somebody, hey, I'm going to give you $100 for this thing today, and then tomorrow I'm going to go down to $50, nobody really likes that. And so it's a little bit of a tough situation that we're in, where and like, it makes sense. If you're a biopharma company, you definitely would say, well, I want the $100, because frankly, all of our budgets and the number of clinical trials we get to run are based off of how much we get paid for some of these drugs. And frankly, it does result in a worse bottom line, potentially worse outcomes, if there's less money for biopharma companies to invest.
Hmm.
And so how do that's a really tough balance. So yeah, I'm not really sure what the solution is there, but curious if you had any thoughts on that.
I don't. I mean, I think that it is absolutely a tough balance. I think incentivizing the pharmaceutical companies to work on the most
Mm,
unmet patient needs, and I think there's certain diseases where there may be too many people developing very similar drugs, and then other really serious diseases, with essentially no one developing drugs because I don't think there's a good business model. So I think real creativity on incentivizing the right areas of focus. And then I do think looking into other areas other than just drug discovery and development dollars, but other parts of the healthcare spend, as I
mhm,
mentioned before, that are perhaps the majority of spend. That potentially we can really become more efficient. And you look at a lot of these new
mhm,
AI tools, hopefully they increase efficiency, and we need far less administrative spend. So more of those dollars can really be on the core understanding of disease biology, development of therapies, getting those
yeah.
therapies approved, and then making it a strong business model for the drug companies, such that they can continue to
Mhm,
uh, invest in the next generation of therapies, um, and that they have the financial resources to attract the
mhm,
best talent. And so I think there's this sort of a virtuous cycle
mhm.
there that is very important. And I think there's other areas of healthcare spend where I think it's a harder argument to make about, we certainly don't want to see areas that are driving no value to keep needing more and more dollars.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a good point. You brought up the cost there, the administrative, potentially the efficiencies you can get from a lot of AI tools. There's so Bessemer released this great checklist of opportunities in health tech earlier in the year. I think they do it every January, and one of the aspects that they talked about, because I think in November ChatGPT had come out, they talked about generative AI opportunities, and so I'm curious about your thoughts on this. Maybe at Path AI, it's enhancing image data sets, or maybe it's creating better data sets, generating new discoveries. Um, but what is your thoughts on this, and ways that these new technologies, and again, some are newer than others, but a lot of these have been around for a while, and probably is the basis of even some of Path AI's original work. But yeah, where do you see the new opportunities in the generative AI space potentially contributing and helping with these efficiencies?
Yeah, so I think on the one hand, you mentioned this sort of generating synthetic training sets that can help then build the most robust generalizable models. We talked about this vision of having the best diagnostics available around
Mhm,
the world. Well, that requires really robust models that are going to work across all different sorts of settings with all different types of technical artifacts and image quality, tissue quality,
Hmm.
stain quality. So generative approaches can be very helpful there, and we've built some of the state-of-the-art methods there for using generative approaches to build the most robust, generalizable models. So I think that's a case we've been working on for years and have built state-of-the-art approaches. I think on the language side, there will be very interesting uses for that. And I think that's going to be for the
Hmm.
communication. How do we best communicate what's in this patient's medical, super complex medical record or chart, with what's in the image, with what's in the literature, to then how do we communicate these
Hmm.
results, the key results, most effectively back to, say, the treating surgeon, the treating
Hmm.
oncologist, the patient, maybe the patient's, other people of different
Hmm.
education levels in different languages. So, like, a lot of this is in a way turning the image, figuring out what's in it, the most salient information to
Hmm.
take out of it. But then there's this huge sort of language synthesis job of the medical literature, the patient's
Yeah.
chart. Who are you actually trying to communicate this to? What decision are they making? Is it a surgeon? Is it an oncologist? Is it a
Hmm.
patient? Is it a child or
Hmm.
something? So I think LLMs could have a major impact. I'm super excited about how to bring these different
Yeah.
things together. Kind of some of what we've historically been building in Vision with some of these new language applications, because at the end of the day, language is extremely important, particularly on the
Hmm.
clinical side for how we communicate results. It's both summarizing all the
Hmm.
literature that's out there, summarizing patient's specific history, summarizing what's in the image, and then making that
Hmm.
actionable for both the patient and
Yeah,
the
and
physician. So yeah, I'm
citing
very
the
excited
right,
about that.
citing the right papers, citing the right places for where certain, and
Yep.
I think this is something I don't remember who I was talking to about this, but somebody had mentioned that you can corroborate this because you probably know it better. But in notes, if you're like a doctor's note, if you're a primary care or if you're a general practitioner and you send or refer a patient to a specialist, the specialist, when they take their notes, they may actually cite various papers. They might actually cite like, oh, this is where I'm getting, like, this is why I think this is what it is, and they might cite papers. And so I'm curious if doctors themselves are doing that, if there was more assistive technologies to help with that, and perhaps even in this, and that's obviously in the clinical setting, but in even in drug discovery and clinical trials, when you're thinking about some of this stuff, how could that help an
Yep.
oncologist through that process? And so I'm wondering, yeah, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's really exciting. I mean, so I think that area is super exciting. There's this company called I'm only just Open Evidence. Have you heard of
I've
this?
heard of it, yeah,
It's sort
just
of
a
like,
bit, but yeah.
yeah, I think it's trying to do this basically. But the big issue with off the shelf
Yeah,
LLMs is they're not specialized for this, and they just, historically,
hallucinate,
and
yeah.
hallucinations are like a major
Yeah.
problem. Like, they sound very confident and just make
Yep.
stuff up. So this one in particular, at least the goal of it is to make sure that it's real evidence and there's citations. It's
Yeah.
not making stuff up. Technically, it does seem like that's
Yeah,
very
totally it is.
doable, especially when you're focusing on a pretty small domain like medicine, not like all
Yeah.
knowledge in the whole
And
world.
even Bard is doing
Um,
some of this, and Google does look at all
are
knowledge,
doing
right?
that.
And Bard, and
Yeah.
because Google has, 20 years of experience doing
Yeah.
basically search links, which is actually what a citation
Yep.
is if you think about it. It's just,
Absolutely.
putting a
Yep.
language model on top of that. And so the question is, can you kind of build
Yep.
both that, just that search graph in some ways, as well as the
Yeah.
LLM to provide a good interface for it?
Yeah. So I think there's a huge opportunity here, of citing the right citations and, maybe making the resident's job to just read what the LLM is coming up with, who's probably better situated to actually do the deep literature search. There's this big
Mhm.
corpus of knowledge, then you have all of this sort of very specific information from this one patient, and how do you kind of link those two
Mhm.
things? Yeah, it's a great application. I'm sure that's where things
Mhm.
are headed. And then the question just is, well, you need some kind of, to the, what you've asked quite a bit about, what's the financial incentive to
Mhm.
build that? And there will be a couple. I mean, one I think would be a lot of like a lot of what notes are optimized for is ensuring that you're getting billed, or that you can bill the
Mhm.
right
Mhm.
things,
Yeah.
so like that you've checked the right boxes such that you can bill a certain code that's hopefully the
Yeah.
appropriate code for
Mhm.
that case. So I think that will be one of the incentives for it. The other would just be
Mhm.
efficiency. So, I mean, physicians spend so much time writing these notes,
Mhm.
reading these notes. So, I do think if something is making them more efficient, that there's some certainly happiness, hopefully patient care, but maybe some other financial
Yeah.
ROI there. So, that's always the challenge in healthcare is figuring out the right incentives. Because in other industries, I feel like the best products win more in a
Yeah.
more obvious way, whereas here, because of the way the payment structure works, I think it's often a little more wandering,
Yeah.
meandering, like how the best products actually get into
Yeah, and
use.
you brought up a good point around the ICD-10 codes or like therapeutic codes as well. I think those codes, that's actually, so that was something that I had tested out with a few friends. We had tested out how can LLM models provide or extract these codes from doctors' notes, and it turns out like
Yeah.
off the shelf ones can do a pretty good job, and then of course if you fine tune them they can do even better. But to your point about financial incentive, that's a case where, well, it's very clear that if you do, and like it's also one of those things we're going back to the question of, could there be misaligned incentives? Obviously the incentive there would be build as much as possible, right? It's the fee for
Right.
service. And so the challenge is, it may very well make it much easier to extract as many of these codes as possible. But at the same time, that's not necessarily the goal, right? The goal is to help the patient, and so how do you kind of balance that too?
Yeah, yeah. I've always thought, and this is not like an area I know of like that I've spent a ton of time in, but I think that I feel like there's going to be this like upcoming war. You hear about like the war between people creating spam and then like the AI dealing with the
Yeah.
spam, and it's like between payers and
Hmm.
providers, with like each one like the providers are going to be armed with some of these new powerful AI tools to bill better or to respond to the refusals to
Uh-huh.
pay better and to automate that. So you're going to have like all these bots on the service provider side. And then what are the payers going to do to not be overwhelmed with all of this better
Yeah.
software to help make claims and get paid? And they're going to have their own way of defending that they're not paying way too much for services that aren't
Yep.
improving outcomes. I've heard much more discussion on the provider side than on the payer side, but I
Yeah, I
assume
think it's
that
because
that
of the
needs to be
incentive, right?
technology
Because yeah, I
development.
would assume that on the provider
Yeah,
side, there's a lot. I mean, again, like, hospitals are known to, not be always great margin businesses, I suppose. So they're always trying to,
yeah,
increase their margins versus payers, make pretty good margins. And so I feel maybe it's just around
yeah,
those, just financial incentive that in the end, providers are the first ones that want to drive that.
yeah. That makes
Um,
sense.
yeah, I thought we could talk a little bit, and yeah, I'm glad we talked a little bit about um, the financial cost. There's in the Bessemer article, there was also one point about the Inflation Act reduction, where I guess patent shelf lives for small molecules were reduced to 9 years, and that could drive down cost to payers providers. And so I'm curious about that. You probably have more insight into this just because you work in this space. I'm curious, how do you see this playing out in terms of biopharma, in terms of their clinical trials, and how do you see that they're currently tackling this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the IRA has many different. It's a complicated law with many different components, so it's not an area of any great depth for me. So really, I know more of what I've heard. The critics, uh, some have said that certain molecules have been shelved because of it. That without it would have taken a risk. Uh, where the risk no longer made financial sense based on the terms of the IRA. So that may be true, and that would be a downside. But I mean, given it's a complicated piece of legislation with other positive elements, I don't know. I honestly
Yeah.
just can't say. I don't know whether the fact that certain molecules won't go
Mhm.
forward, whether that will be worth it or not. But I certainly believe that pharma will be adjusting their R and
Mhm.
D spend in different ways based on this new piece of
Yeah,
legislation.
makes sense. And yeah, I mean, and one other point that they brought up was around biosecurity. And so you brought up this point around, maybe adversarial between providers and payers. Uh, what about, with AI driven drug discovery, there's definitely concerns about potentially having people develop compounds that could harm others. And so, what do you think the role of startups and biopharma and others are in this challenge? And do you feel like there will be startups that kind of tackle it, or do you feel that there's a different way that we should approach this?
Yeah. So I mean, I would my knee jerk reaction would be that this would be a good area for the government or sort of a large and maybe
Hmm.
international collaboration, very much top
Hmm.
down, uh, to put together standards for how to do risk mitigation and prevent the worst possible outcomes of these sort of biosafety
Hmm.
concerns. So I would think that's would be really really important, both international collaboration, but also within countries as well. In terms of startups, I mean, it would have to be how are they gonna be well positioned for this? Who's going to be paying them? I mean, certainly in cybersecurity, that's like an existential threat for each individual company. So cybersecurity, that is an area where there are many very successful
Hmm.
startups. It's harder to picture because I feel like these threats are more society
Yeah.
wide and less single business focused. So it's hard to picture single businesses sort of paying a biosecurity firm in the way they pay a
Yeah.
cybersecurity
Fair
firm.
point.
So I think because there aren't existential threats for individual companies, they're more society wide. Probably the solution is more top
Mm.
down,
Yeah,
sort of
and probably governments
society
will be the
wide.
ones to pay
But what do you
for
think?
any tool that then might be there to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
true. Right. So you could yeah, like build you could start a company where the main customer would be the government.
Mm.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah, that's
sense.
totally fair. Um, yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. I thought we could end the session with some advice. What advice would you give to founders trying to build doing well by doing good companies, or professionals looking to work for one like Path AI?
Yeah. So for looking to build companies, one, it's a really exciting, probably the most impactful thing, one of the most impactful things you can do, whether it succeeds or fails. I think you will learn a lot, and uh, and I think society can really benefit from it. So I'm a huge proponent of uh, folks doing it, even if it's difficult. Um, and I think the hardest part is definitely and a lot of this can be done through talking to people and thinking and asking a lot of questions and talking to smart people. Just, I mean, it really is the unique business model challenges within healthcare and really talking to customers and not focusing on the technology, not saying LLMs
Hmm.
are the new thing. So how are we going to
Yeah.
make money with LLMs? But to be like, what are the biggest challenges? Look at how are these, 20% of the economy, like where are those dollars
Hmm.
being allocated and where are there really unmet needs there where you can have a very clear financial ROI that also is doing good. And a lot of that can be done pre-product, any investments in technology. And I would just say, talking to potential customers, really getting to
Hmm.
know them. What do they need? How many barriers would have to be overcome to be able to sort of justify the financial return on investment? What are sales cycle like? So I would focus a lot on the sort of sales
Hmm.
side of it, and then work backwards from there. Versus starting with the deep technology and hoping you find a good use
Wow,
case.
great advice. Thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for
All
having
right.
me.
Bye.
Bye.
Cool.